The day they buried Winifred Ralston's husband, the sky over Dry Creek, Texas turned the color of a bruise, and every single soul in that dusty little town had something to say about it except for the one man who mattered most. It was the spring of 1882, and the territory was still raw in all the ways that mattered: raw with heat, raw with grief, raw with the particular kind of loneliness that settles into a person's bones when the frontier strips everything away and leaves you standing in red dirt with nothing but the wind for company. Winifred stood at the edge of the hole they dug for her husband, Thomas Ralston, and she listened to the Reverend read from Psalms in that flat, practiced voice of his, and she thought about how strange it was that a man could be alive one morning and underground by afternoon, and how the world just kept turning its indifferent face toward the sun regardless. Thomas had been a good man. Not a great man, and not a passionate man, but a good one. He had built her a house with 2 windows that faced east, because she'd told him once that she liked to watch the sunrise. He had died of a fever that came on fast and left him hollowed out in 4 days, and there had been nothing the doctor in town could do except press a cold cloth to his forehead and charge Winifred $2 for the privilege. She was 26 years old, and she was a widow, and the life she had carefully and quietly constructed on the edge of this untamed country had just been placed in a pine box and lowered 6 feet into the Texas earth. The Reverend kept talking. The small crowd of townsfolk shuffled and murmured their condolences in low voices. Mrs. Hattie Beaumont, who ran the dry goods store and considered herself the social authority of Dry Creek, leaned over and pressed Winifred's hand and said something about God's plan. Mr. Abel Tucker, who had worked the adjacent cattle land and owed Thomas $20 he would never now have to repay, said that Thomas was a fine man and that Winifred ought not to worry because the Lord would provide. The schoolteacher, a pale young woman named Clara Potts, quoted scripture. The blacksmith said nothing but cried openly, because he had liked Thomas's company on Sunday afternoons, and that small open display of grief was actually the most honest thing that happened at that burial, until the moment that changed everything. He came from the direction of the corral, walking slow and deliberate the way a man walks when he is trying not to intrude but has decided to come anyway. Winifred noticed him because everyone else was watching her face for the acceptable performance of grief, and she had taken to watching the horizon instead, watching anything that wasn't a pitying face. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with the sun-darkened skin of a man who had spent years outdoors without apology. He wore a dark coat over a plain shirt, worn boots that had seen serious country, and a hat he held in both hands in front of him, brimmed down, as though he was carrying something fragile. He walked to the edge of the gathered mourners, and then he kept walking, and he came and stood right beside Winifred Ralston at the graveside, and he sat down on the low stone wall that bordered the small cemetery plot, and he said absolutely nothing at all. He did not say he was sorry. He did not offer a scripture or a proverb. He did not tell her that Thomas was in a better place, or that she was young and would find happiness again, or that everything happened according to some divine design that she simply did not yet have the wisdom to understand. He sat down beside her, and he was present, and the warmth of another living person, solid and quiet, was so unexpectedly right that Winifred had to press her teeth together hard to keep from crying in a way that had nothing to do with sorrow. She did not know his name. She had seen him before. She had seen most people in Dry Creek at least in passing, but she could not place him. When the burial concluded and people began moving back toward town, pressing her hands and offering their inadequate words, the man stood, put his hat back on his head, touched the brim once in her direction, and walked back the way he had come. He never spoke a single word. Winifred stood in the cemetery for a long time after everyone else left. She stood there thinking about all the things people had said to her that afternoon, and how every single word had felt like a small stone placed on her chest rather than removed from it. And she thought about the man who had sat down beside her, and the particular quality of his silence, which had felt less like absence and more like the most thoughtful presence she had encountered in years. She remembered that longer than every word anyone else spoke. The weeks that followed were hard in the practical way that death in the West was always hard. Thomas had left Winifred with the house, with a small herd of cattle, 17 head with 2 horses, with a modest store of provisions, and with a piece of land that the bank in San Antonio held a partial note against. She had until the end of June to make a payment or the land reverted. It was May. She had $30 and some change in the tin box under the floorboard, and she knew how to cook and clean and keep a house, but she knew very little about managing cattle alone or negotiating with bankers, or doing any of the 100 things that Thomas had quietly handled without her. Mrs. Hattie Beaumont came by twice with casseroles and suggestions that Winifred might want to think about returning to her family in Missouri. Winifred thanked her for the casseroles and said nothing about Missouri, because her family in Missouri consisted of an elderly aunt who smelled of camphor and disapproval, and going back there felt like a kind of surrender she was not prepared to make. Abel Tucker came by to inquire, with a carefully composed expression of generosity, whether she might be interested in selling the land, since he had always thought it would work well together with his own spread. She thanked him too, and closed the door on him with a firmness that expressed itself without any need for additional words. She was determined. She was frightened, but she was determined, and there is a particular stubbornness in frightened women that the world has chronically underestimated. It was on the second Saturday after the burial that she went to the general store to trade a jar of preserves for coffee and a length of practical fabric, and she saw him again. He was at the counter, speaking with old Mr. Greer who ran the store, and he was asking in a low, measured voice about feed prices and whether a shipment of wire had come in on the last supply wagon. He turned when she pushed through the door, and his eyes found her immediately, and she saw something cross his face that she couldn't quite name. Recognition, yes, but also something more careful than that. He stepped to the side to give her room at the counter, and he touched his hat. "Mrs. Ralston," he said. "I hope you are keeping well." She was startled that he knew her name, and then felt foolish for being startled, because in a town the size of Dry Creek, everyone knew everyone's name, and the widow of a recently deceased cattle farmer was not exactly an obscure figure. "Thank you," she said, and then because she had been thinking about him off and on for 2 weeks with a persistent curiosity she could not entirely account for, she said, "I am afraid I don't know your name." "Frederick Donnelly," he said. "I have the land to the north of yours along the creek line. I came in about 8 months ago. I don't think we were ever formally introduced." 8 months. That explained why she couldn't precisely place him, though she had certainly seen him at a distance here and there, and knew that someone had taken up the old Harmon parcel. "Winifred Ralston," she said, which was unnecessary but felt like the correct thing to say. "I know," he said, and there was a quietness in his voice that was not coldness but something more like steadiness, the way a rock in a creek is quiet. He looked at her for just a moment longer than convention strictly required, and then he looked back at Mr. Greer and concluded his business, and Winifred conducted hers, and they walked out the door at nearly the same moment. On the porch of the general store in the bright May sun she stopped and said, "Why did you come to the burial? You didn't know Thomas." He considered this with the same care he seemed to apply to most things. He was looking out at the street, at the horses tied at the hitching post, and the 2 men arguing outside the saloon, and the little clouds of dust the wind kicked up between the buildings. "I didn't come for Thomas," he said. "I saw you standing there, and you looked like you needed someone to stand beside you who wasn't trying to say something useful." He paused. "I'm not always good at words, but I can sit beside a person." Winifred looked at him. The sun was in her eyes and she raised a hand against it. "That was the most useful thing anyone did all afternoon," she said. He looked at her then fully, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but was in the vicinity of one. "Good," he said. He put on his hat. If you need anything, Mrs. Ralston, I'm not far." He walked to his horse, a good-looking roan quarter horse that was standing with the particular patience of a well-trained animal, swung up into the saddle with the easy economy of a man who had been riding most of his life, and rode out of town heading north. Winifred watched him go, and she told herself that the warmth she felt was just the May sun on the back of her neck, which was not entirely true. The cattle situation became urgent faster than she had hoped. One of the 17 head was ailing, and though she could see that the animal was struggling, she did not have Thomas's eye for the specific nature of what was wrong, and by the time she had thought seriously about riding to town and asking for the help of a veterinarian, a luxury that would cost more than she easily had, the cow had died. 16 head. She was calculating in her head constantly, measuring what 16 cattle represented against the payment due to the bank, against the cost of feed through the summer, against the wages she could not afford to pay a hand. It was while she was fencing, or attempting to fence, attempting being the operative word, because her experience with a post-hole digger was theoretical at best, that she became aware of hoofbeats coming along the property line to the north, and looked up to see Frederick Donnelly riding toward her on the roan, leading a gray pack horse. He pulled up 10 yards away and looked at the fence post she was wrestling with, which was leaning at approximately 35 degrees from vertical, and she watched a series of thoughts cross his face. "I'm fine," she said preemptively. "I can see that," he said, without any particular inflection. He stepped down from the roan anyway, tied both horses to a nearby tree, walked over, took the post-hole digger from her in a way that was somehow not a taking away but a helping with, and drove it into the earth with 3 clean strokes to a depth that she had been struggling toward for 20 minutes. He pulled it out, set the post, tamped the earth around it, checked the level with a small tool from his coat pocket, and looked up at her. "My hands are not soft," she said, holding them up to show him. "They were red and slightly blistered. I was getting there." "You were," he agreed. He looked at the remaining line of posts that needed setting, which was a considerable line. "I've got the afternoon free," he said. It was not an offer exactly. It was more of a statement of fact presented alongside a question. Winifred Ralston was a woman with a great deal of pride, and she had been raised to believe that accepting help was something to be done carefully and sparingly, and with full accounting of the debt. But she was also a woman with 16 cattle and a fence line that was mostly theoretical, and she had the particular intelligence that comes from being willing to see a situation clearly when it matters. "Then I'd be obliged," she said. They worked side by side through the afternoon, and she noticed things about him that she filed away without entirely meaning to. He worked with a steady, unhurried thoroughness, each post set with care, not rushed through but done right. He did not fill the silence with talk, but when she spoke he listened with his full attention in a way that was surprisingly uncommon in her experience. He had a small scar along his left jawline from something she didn't ask about. His hands were very capable. He said please and thank you to her at natural intervals, the kind of courtesy that came from genuine consideration rather than performance. "Where did you come from?" she asked toward the end of the afternoon, when the fence line was beginning to look like it might actually contain cattle rather than merely suggest the idea of containing them. "Montana, originally," he said. "Before that, Indiana. What brought you to Texas?" He was quiet for a moment, driving a post. Then he said, "I worked a cattle drive up through the territories 4 years ago. There was land available here that I could afford, and the winters are milder." She understood that there was probably more to that answer than he had offered, the way you understand that a river has more depth than its surface reveals, but she didn't push. She told him about her own arrival in Texas. She'd come with Thomas 3 years ago from Kentucky, chasing the particular dream of open land that had already faded somewhat from its original romantic brightness by the time they'd arrived, but that had still been theirs, and that she was not prepared to surrender. Listened, and when she finished he said, That's worth holding on to. The land or the dream? Both, he said. By the time the sun was 2 hours from setting, the fence was done, and Winifred stood back and looked at it with a satisfaction that was more complex than simple accomplishment. Frederick watered his horses from the trough near her barn, and she went inside and came back with 2 cups of coffee and a plate of cornbread, because it was what she had and it seemed inadequate and it also seemed right. He accepted both with a genuine gratitude that made the offering feel sufficient. They sat on the porch steps, not close, properly spaced, and drank the coffee and watched the long Texas evening begin to lay itself down over the hills. A mockingbird started up from somewhere in the live oak tree at the edge of the yard, running through its repertoire with the manic joy of a creature who has no knowledge of grief or bank notes or loneliness. "I'm going to keep it," she said, without preamble, meaning the land, and he understood that without any clarification being required. "I know," he said. "I may need to hire on," she said. "I can't work 16 head alone through the summer and make the payment by June." He nodded slowly, looking at the horizon. "I know a man," he said. "Goes by Ruiz. He's honest and he's good with cattle. Works short-term contracts, not looking for a permanent arrangement. I could send him your way if you're willing. What do you know about him?" "I know he did 3 months for me last fall without a complaint and without a single animal lost. And I know he's fair," he added, with a specificity that suggested the fairness was something he considered particularly important in a person. "I'll speak with him," she said. He finished his coffee, stood, set the cup on the porch rail. "Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Ralston." "Winifred," she said, and then felt a small bolt of something she could not immediately categorize moving through her chest. He looked at her. That careful look again, like a man reading weather. "Frederick," he said, and touched his hat, and rode away north through the long golden light. Miguel Ruiz arrived at her door 3 days later, a compact, weathered man in his late 30s with a direct gaze and a handshake that communicated, as good handshakes do, an entire character. He was from San Antonio originally, the son of cattle workers, and he knew cattle the way some people know music, with an intuition that went beyond the practical. He named a fair price for his work. She negotiated it down by 20 cents a day. He accepted the counter with a nod that suggested he respected the negotiation, and they shook hands again, and the arrangement was made. Having Ruiz there changed the arithmetic of her days considerably. He slept in the small outbuilding behind the barn, cooked his own meals over a modest fire, and worked with a quiet competency that made the herd feel less like a weight and more like a manageable fact. He called her Mrs. Ralston, and she called him Ruiz, and they had an understanding that was professional and respectful and uncomplicated, which was exactly what she needed. Frederick came by twice in the following 2 weeks, both times with practical reasons. The first time to mention that he'd seen the creek run higher than usual, and that she might want to move the cattle to the upper pasture to avoid the lower ground getting boggy, which was genuine and useful information. The second time he brought a sack of seed corn that he said he'd overpurchased, and that would go bad before he could use it all, which she accepted with the same straightforward grace with which it was offered, though she was not entirely certain the surplus was as accidental as presented. She began to look for the roan horse when she was working outside. She told herself this was because she had good eyes and noticed things, which was true and entirely beside the point. In June, something happened that recalibrated everything. Abel Tucker had apparently not accepted her door closing as a final answer, and he came by with a man from the bank. Not the San Antonio bank that held the note on her land, but a different bank. A loan office that had apparently set up in Dry Creek while she wasn't paying attention, operating out of a room above the hardware store. The man's name was Clemens, and he was dressed for a city that did not exist within 200 miles of where he was standing, and he smiled with the particular warmth of a person whose warmth is a tool. Clemens explained to Winifred, on her own porch, that he had a proposal that might resolve her financial difficulties very conveniently. Tucker would purchase her land outright at a price that was. He used the word generous twice in quick succession, which she noted that would give her enough to pay off the bank note and have a modest remainder. Tucker would take on the note and the cattle, and she would be free of the whole difficult burden. He said the word burden with a sympathy that made her jaw ache. "I'm not looking to be free of it," she said. Clemens smiled again. Of course. But for a woman in your situation, my situation," she said, "is that I own land and cattle and my payment to the San Antonio Bank is made on time. I don't see a problem that needs a solution." Tucker, who had been standing just behind Clemens with his hat in his hand, said, "Winifred, be reasonable. It's a lot for a woman alone." She looked at him. She had known Abel Tucker for 3 years, and she had always thought of him as a harmless sort of man, not particularly clever or courageous, but not malicious either. She revised that assessment now. "I appreciate the visit," she said, and went inside and closed the door, and this time she shot the bolt. She stood in her kitchen for a long moment, pressing her hands flat on the table, feeling the anger move through her in a long, slow wave. Then she sat down and did the arithmetic again, carefully and completely, because the best response to a person who thinks you cannot manage is to manage with precision. When she finished, she found that if the cattle sold well, if she could make the June payment and the September payment, and by September the worst of it would be past. She rode to Frederick's that afternoon, not because she needed his help, but because she needed to tell someone who would understand the particular nature of what had just happened, and he was the person she wanted to tell. She had not articulated this to herself clearly enough to examine it, but she was a woman of some self-knowledge, and the fact of it was sitting plainly in the middle of her chest. His spread was modest but well kept, a good house, solid barn, pasture that looked carefully managed, a kitchen garden that surprised her, because most single men in the territory had kitchen gardens that were either non-existent or catastrophic. He was in the barn when she rode up, and he came out at the sound of hooves with his hand resting on the doorframe, and when he saw it was her a thing happened in his face that he almost immediately composed into its usual quietness, but she caught it, and she filed it. "Tucker came today," she said, without dismounting, and she told him about it. The banker and the proposal and the word burden delivered with counterfeit sympathy, and she watched Frederick's expression move through careful attention to something that was definitely anger, though he wore it quietly the way he wore most things. "He'll come back," Frederick said. "Tucker's patient when there's land involved." "Let him," she said. "He's going to run out of patience before I run out of land." Frederick looked up at her on the horse, and the late afternoon light was on his face, and he said, "I don't doubt it." And then he said, "Will you have supper? I've got a pot of beans on and cornbread, and I should warn you it's nothing compared to yours." She had not expected the invitation, and she found herself saying yes before she had fully considered it, which was fine because, when she did consider it, she still would have said yes. She tied her horse to the post, and they went inside, and she found that his house was clean and sparse, and had the particular character of a place that belonged deeply to the person who lived in it. They ate at his table, which was near a window that faced west, and the sunset came in orange and pink and a deep, unlikely purple, and they talked more freely than they had before, the way people sometimes do when they are inside and the door is closed. He told her about the cattle drive that had brought him to Texas, through the territories in the late 1870s, through country that was hard and beautiful and unforgiving in equal measure, with a crew of men he had been glad to work alongside. She asked what he had been before the cattle drives, and he was quiet for a moment, and then said that he'd worked his family's farm in Indiana until his father passed, and then there had been nothing there to stay for, and the West had seemed as good a direction as any. "Do you miss Indiana?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "In the spring when things are coming up. Indiana spring is very green. I miss the green." "Kentucky is green," she said softly. "I miss it too sometimes. But I don't miss being there." He understood that. She could see that he understood it. She did not stay long past supper propriety, and also the ride back in the growing dark required attention. But when she left, and he walked with her to the horse and stood holding the bridle while she mounted, there was a moment when his hand was near hers on the saddle horn, and neither of them moved for just a fraction of a second longer than was strictly necessary, and the whole evening air seemed to hold its breath. "Thank you," she said. "Any time," he said. He said it simply, and she believed him completely, and that was the thing that undid her a little bit, riding home through the Texas night with the stars coming out in their extravagant abundance overhead, because she had learned not to entirely believe any time from anyone, and finding that she believed it from him was a discovery that changed the landscape of things. The cattle sold well at the late June market in Abilene, not spectacular, but solidly profitable, enough to make the payment and keep through September. Miguel Ruiz did his job with an excellence that made her grateful, and when she paid him at the end of the contracted period, she gave him an extra $2, which he tried to decline, and which she pressed back into his hands with a firmness that he eventually accepted. "If you need hands in the fall," he said, "send word." "I will," she said, and meant it. She went to the bank and made her payment in person, because she wanted the banker in San Antonio to look at her face when she put the money on his desk, which he did with a mild surprise that she found satisfying. On the ride back, she stopped in Dry Creek to pick up supplies, and she was coming out of the general store when she nearly walked directly into Frederick, who was coming in with a list in his hand, and his hat slightly pushed back on his head, which she was beginning to understand was the way he wore it when he was in a thinking mood. They both stopped, and there was a moment of the particular mutual awkwardness that happens when two people have been thinking about each other and have not yet found a way to address it, which was followed by Frederick saying, "How was Abilene?" Because he had known she was going, she had mentioned it in passing, and she said, "Productive," and smiled. And he smiled back, a real smile this time, not in the vicinity of one but an actual smile, and it changed his face entirely, opening it up into something warm and almost young, and she thought that if he smiled like that more often it would cause her serious difficulty. They walked together up the street without having decided to, and Winifred told him about the sale and the payment, and Frederick listened with the focused satisfaction of a person who genuinely cares about the outcome. He bought her a cup of coffee at the small eating establishment that Mrs. Dobbins ran from her front rooms, and she let him, and they sat across from each other at a table covered in oilcloth, and the afternoon light came through the window onto his hands where they wrapped around the coffee cup, and she was aware, in a way that was becoming impossible to be unaware of, that she was happy in this specific company in a way she had not been with any person in a very long time. "I should tell you something," she said, looking at the coffee rather than at him, because this was easier and also because she needed to say it even if it was difficult. "The morning of the burial, when you sat down beside me and didn't say anything, I have been thinking about that since it happened. Most of what people said to me that day I've already forgotten. What you did I haven't." He was quiet for a moment. She looked up. He was watching her with that careful regard that she had come to understand was not distance but its opposite, the attention of a person who is taking something seriously. "I wasn't sure it was the right thing to do," he said. "I almost didn't come at all. I'd only seen you from a distance and I didn't know Thomas, and I thought, what business is it of mine?" He paused. "But you looked like you were carrying something very heavy and being watched while you did it, and I thought sometimes a person just needs someone sitting beside them." "Yes," she said. "That is exactly what it was." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. The coffee was terrible, which they both seemed to recognize simultaneously, and which produced a shared expression of suppressed opinion that was funnier than anything either of them said. "Mrs. Dobbins' coffee has always been a sacrifice," he said. "It tastes like it was made before the war," she said. "Which war?" he said. She laughed. It came out of her suddenly and freely, and she pressed her hand over her mouth like a person who has been surprised by their own joy, and he watched her laugh with an expression that she would have described, if she were being entirely honest with herself, as something very close to tender. July arrived, and with it the particular brutality of a Texas summer, the kind of heat that makes the air above the road shimmer, and the cattle stand in whatever shade they can find, and the days feel very long and very flat. Winifred managed her herd with a diligence that would have astonished the people who thought she could not, checking the water levels in the creek, rotating the pasture, keeping careful records in the ledger book that Thomas had started and that she had continued in her own more precise handwriting. She mended her own fences, correctly this time, and patched the roof where a spring storm had loosened some boards, and rode to town once a week for supplies and mail and the small, necessary commerce of community. She and Frederick had fallen into a rhythm without precisely arranging it. He came by roughly twice a week, sometimes with a practical purpose and sometimes with less of one, bringing her a hinge he'd noticed was needed on her barn door, or asking her opinion on a piece of land he was thinking of acquiring, or simply riding along the creek line that divided their properties and stopping to talk over the fence. She went to his place for supper once a week, or he came to hers, and they cooked and talked and sat on porches watching the evening, and all of it was conducted in the territory of friendship while both of them were aware, without saying so, that it was also something else. It was Hattie Beaumont who made it explicit, in the way of small towns everywhere, by mentioning to Winifred one afternoon in the dry goods store that it was very interesting how much time Mr. Donnelly seemed to be spending at the Ralston property, with the precise intonation of a woman who does not consider it interesting at all, but rather a matter requiring open discussion and preferably correction. Winifred looked at Hattie Beaumont and said, "Mr. Donnelly is my neighbor and my friend, and I find his company enjoyable, which I believe is the ordinary basis for spending time with a person." Hattie Beaumont's eyebrows went to a height that expressed extensive opinion without the need for words, which was a skill she had apparently developed over decades. "I am 26 years old, Mrs. Beaumont," Winifred added pleasantly, "and I have been managing my own affairs fairly well. I expect I can manage this one too." She bought her coffee and her flour and left with the brisk step of a woman who has made her point clearly, and on the ride home she found herself thinking not about Hattie Beaumont's implication, but about the fact that the implication was true, and that she was spending a great deal of time with Frederick Donnelly, and that the thought of him was present in her days in a way that was warm and consistent and entirely welcome, and that she was not, upon examination, afraid of that. The question was whether Frederick was not afraid of it either, and the answer to that question seemed to be contained somewhere in his careful, quiet manner, in the way his eyes tracked to her when she entered a room, in the way he listened, in the way he had sat down beside her at a burial and said nothing when nothing was exactly what was needed. She thought she knew the answer, but she was a woman who had learned the value of not rushing toward things, who understood that certain kinds of trust are built through patience and not through demand. It was the first week of August when the matter of Abel Tucker came to a head for the second and final time. Winifred had ridden out early to check the north fence line, the part that ran along the creek where Frederick had warned her about boggy ground, and found it cut. Deliberately cut, not broken by weather or animal, but cut in 3 neat sections that left a gap wide enough for cattle to walk through easily, and she stood there in the early morning light and understood exactly what had happened and who had done it and why. 2 of her cattle were already through and grazing on the other side. She repaired the fence herself, which took 2 hours of sweating work in the already climbing heat, and got the cattle back, and counted the herd twice to be certain she hadn't lost any others. She had not. 16 head, all present. Then she rode to town. She went to the sheriff's office, which was occupied by a man named Walt Bridges, who had held the position for 11 years, and who took it seriously in the particular way of men who have seen enough trouble to know that most of it comes from a small number of people behaving badly. She told him about the fence and about Tucker's previous visit, and she was calm and specific in the telling, which Walt Bridges appreciated because he was a man who valued clarity. Bridges rode out to the Ralston property himself that afternoon and looked at the fence cuts, and then he rode to Tucker's spread, and Winifred did not accompany him because she understood that her presence would complicate rather than assist. She went home and waited and mended a shirt and tried not to be as angry as she was, which was extremely angry. Frederick came by at some point in the middle of the afternoon. She heard the roan before she saw it, as she often did now, and she went to the door and she told him what had happened, quickly and flatly, and she saw the same controlled anger she had seen in him before, sitting quiet in his jaw and in the set of his shoulders. "Bridges is a good man," Frederick said. "He'll sort it." "I know," she said. "I'm more angry than worried." "That's the right proportion," he said. He stayed until Bridges came back, which was 2 hours, and when the sheriff came to the door he said that Tucker had denied it, but that 2 of his hands had been seen in the north pasture area by a reliable witness, which turned out to be old Eli Crow, who was a Comanche man who lived on a small plot at the edge of the territory, who had been there since before any of the current settlers, and whose word Bridges trusted absolutely, and Winifred was privately grateful for that trust. Because there were plenty of men in that county who would not have accepted Eli's testimony for reasons she found shameful. Tucker received a formal warning with legal weight behind it, which was not imprisonment and perhaps not justice in the fullest sense, but which was enough to make him very clearly understand that the next incident would have consequences that exceeded a conversation. He did not come back after that. Winifred suspected he had turned his acquisitive attention toward a cattle operation in the next county, which was his loss and someone else's problem. After Bridges left, she and Frederick sat on the porch in the long late daylight, and the crisis was over, and she felt it go out of her like water out of a cupped hand, leaving behind something that was tired but also, surprisingly, lighter. "I'm grateful you stayed," she said. "I wasn't going anywhere," he said, and there was something in the simplicity of it that was so straightforwardly true that she had to look away for a moment, at the pasture and the creek shining in the distance and the familiar, hard, beautiful land. She said his name, just that, Frederick, and he turned to look at her and she said, "I want you to know I want to be clear with you about something." She paused, ordering her words the way she ordered everything carefully. "I am not a woman who does things indirectly. I think you may be aware that I have feelings for you that go beyond neighborly regard, and I think you may, though I don't want to presume, have some similar feelings, and I would rather say so plainly than manage around it indefinitely, because life is short and fences get cut while you're not looking and nothing is guaranteed." The silence lasted long enough that she began to seriously consider how far it was to Missouri and whether her aunt would be home, and then he said, quietly and with a warmth that reached her clearly, "I have thought about you every day since the first time I saw you. I came to that burial because I wanted to be near you, and I told myself it was because you needed someone sitting beside you, which was true, but it was also because I could not find a good reason not to come, and you were all I could think about when I heard about your husband and I thought about you standing there alone." She stared at him. "That first time you saw me, when was that?" 3 months before the burial," he said, with a slight quality she had never quite heard from him before, something almost rueful. "You were riding along the south pasture on a gray horse, not the gray you have now, a different one, and you stopped to look at something in the sky. I don't know what you saw, but you stopped and you looked at it with your whole face, the way a person looks at something they're genuinely glad to see, and I thought." He stopped. "What did you think?" she asked very quietly. "I thought I would like to know what that person sees," he said. "I thought I would like to be near a person who looks at things like that." Winifred Ralston sat with that for a moment. The mockingbird in the live oak was back, or its descendant, performing the same extravagant repertoire. The last light was going the color of old copper. She reached across the small space between them and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee, and he turned his hand palm up immediately and folded his fingers around hers with a steadiness and a care that was entirely characteristic. And she thought that she had been right about the quality of his silence at the burial, that it was not emptiness, but fullness, the fullness of a person who attends completely to whatever is in front of him, who is all the way present in the specific place where he is. And she thought that this was the rarest thing she had encountered, this kind of presence, and that she was not going to be foolish about it. They sat like that in the long, quiet August evening, hands together, not saying much, because they were past the point where silence was ambiguous, and the particular piece of it was extraordinary. There was still a great deal to navigate. Winifred was a widow 7 months out from her husband's death, and while the grief she carried for Thomas was honest if not shattering, she was conscious of the practical rhythms of propriety that a small community like Dry Creek required, not because she cared deeply for the opinions of Hattie Beaumont or Abel Tucker, but because she would have to live here, and because Frederick would have to live here, and the texture of daily life was easier when it was not swimming against unnecessary currents. They were careful and public in their care. He came to Sunday services, which he had not previously attended with any regularity, and they stood together at the back and walked to the general store afterward for coffee, and people saw them, and people talked, and most of what people said was a reasonable version of the truth, which was that the widow Ralston and the northern neighbor seemed to be keeping company with mutual enjoyment and respect. Reverend Cole, who was a more thoughtful man than his flat delivery might suggest, found Winifred after service one Sunday in September and said, gently, that he thought it was a fine thing to see her finding her footing again, and that there was no scripture he was aware of that required a person to be unhappy, which was his oblique but sincere endorsement, and she thanked him for it genuinely. It was also in September that Winifred and Frederick had their first real argument, which was about the north pasture, specifically about whether she should sell the north 40 acres to reduce the bank note, which he thought was unnecessary, and she thought was her decision and not his, and it erupted on a Tuesday morning over coffee in her kitchen in a way that surprised both of them. He said something about the note that implied she had not fully considered the risk, and she said something about the fact that she had been managing the risk alone for 4 months before he started weighing in, and there was a silence that was nothing like the pleasant kind, and then he put his coffee down and said, "You're right. I apologize. It's your land and your decision." She looked at him. He meant it. It was not a strategic retreat or an appeasement. He had recognized that he was wrong and said so without elaboration or condition. She had been in sufficient conversations with men to understand how unusual this was, and she said, "I appreciate that," and meant it with the same directness, and they finished the coffee, and the argument was over, and they were somehow closer on the other side of it than they had been before, which is the property of certain arguments between people who are honest with each other. She did not sell the North 40. She made the September payment from cattle sales and a small amount from selling 2 horses she didn't need, and the arithmetic worked out, and by October the worst of it was truly behind her, and she was beginning to imagine the spring. In October, Frederick came to supper on a Thursday evening, and he was quiet in a way that was not his ordinary quiet, not restful but fidgeting, though he barely moved, which she was coming to understand was how his fidgeting manifested, in a kind of interior stillness that was too careful, too held together. She put the food on the table and sat across from him and said, "What is it?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it properly, and I've been trying to find the proper way since July, which tells you something about my eloquence." Her heart did something that had no relation to her cardiovascular health. "Ask," she said. "I would like to marry you," he said. "I would like that more than I've wanted anything in a considerable while. I think you know that He paused, and something crossed his face, raw and real and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen it. "I am not a man who is very good at saying what he feels. I'm better at showing it. but I want to say it now clearly because you deserve to hear it clearly. I love you. I loved you before I knew what to do about it, and I've been sitting with it for months trying to figure out how to say it in a way that was worthy of you saying it too. And I haven't managed anything that feels adequate, so I'm just saying it plainly and hoping that you can hear what's underneath the plain words. Winifred put both her hands flat on the table and pressed them down, the way she had done in the kitchen the day Tucker came, but for an entirely different reason, because she needed something solid under her palms while the whole room seemed to rearrange itself. She said, "Frederick," and her voice was not entirely steady, which it rarely was not, and she was glad to feel it unsteady because it was true. "I love you. I have been in love with you since August at minimum, and I have been trying to be thoughtful about it because I have things to consider and a herd to keep and a land payment to make, but I have thought about you every single morning when I wake up, and the days you don't come by are less than the days you do, and yes, I will marry you." He exhaled, which was the most revealing thing she had ever seen him do. A long, slow breath that contained approximately 4 months of carefully maintained composure. And she laughed. And then he laughed. And it was the second time she had laughed like that in his presence and the second time it had remade the room. And then they were both standing because she had stood and he had stood and they were on the same side of the table. And his hands were on her face, careful and warm. And she was looking up at him. And he kissed her with the same quality that characterized everything he did, completely, attentively, with a thoroughness that made the world outside the kitchen a very abstract concern for a very long minute. They told Reverend Cole on Sunday, who said he was not surprised, with a satisfaction that suggested he was also pleased. They told Hattie Beaumont, who declared that she had seen it coming from the first week of June and would provide a cake, which she did, and it was actually excellent. They told Miguel Ruiz by letter, because he had moved on to a job in the next county, and he wrote back with a warmth that made Winifred fold the letter carefully and keep it in the box where she kept important things. The wedding was in November, 3 days before Thanksgiving, in the small white church on the edge of Dry Creek, and it was not a large affair because neither of them wanted a large affair, but it was a true one. Walt Bridges stood up for Frederick. Clara Potts, the schoolteacher, stood up for Winifred. Old Mr. Greer from the general store came and wept openly, because he was a sentimental man and weddings were one of the few occasions that reliably reached him, and he was not embarrassed about it. Reverend Cole read from Corinthians, the real one, about love being patient and kind, not puffed up or easily provoked, and Winifred thought that it described Frederick Donnelly with a precision that could not be accidental. They exchanged rings that Frederick had ordered from a jeweler in San Antonio, simple gold bands, nothing elaborate, which was exactly right for both of them. When the Reverend said he could kiss his bride, Frederick turned to her with that slight shift in expression that she had come to understand was his version of being moved beyond his usual control, and he kissed her gently, and she squeezed his hand, and the small congregation applauded with genuine happiness, which was the best kind. The reception was held in the church hall, with Hattie Beaumont's cake, and a pot roast that 3 women from the congregation had collaborated on, and a fiddle player named Absalom who played reels until 9 o'clock in the evening, and who was very good at it. Frederick danced with Winifred twice, which was 2 more times than she had expected, given that she had never seen him dance, and he was not accomplished at it, but he was earnest and willing, and she told him so, and he said, "I'm better at things that don't require music," which made her laugh against his shoulder while they moved through an approximation of a waltz. They rode home together that night to what was now their home. They had decided she would move into his house, which was larger, and let the Ralston house stand for the time being. And the night was very cold and very clear, with more stars than the sky seemed designed to hold, and the horses moved together in comfortable companionship through the dark, and Winifred Ralston, who was now Winifred Donnelly and who felt the weight and rightness of that name in equal measure, looked up at the stars and felt the solidity of the man riding beside her, and thought about a day in May when she had been standing in a cemetery under a bruised sky, and a stranger had sat down beside her and said, "Nothing," and how that nothing had been the beginning of everything. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was Frederick and Winifred's first winter together, and it was a winter of discovering each other in the close quarters of a shared life, which is always instructive. She learned that he rose earlier than she did, that he made better cornbread than she had assumed, that he read books when he could get them, and had a small collection that she added to with regularity, that he was patient about nearly everything, but had a streak of perfectionism about his fences and his tools that she found both admirable and occasionally exhausting, and that he slept on his left side and sometimes talked in his sleep in a voice too low to decode, and that his hand sought hers in the dark with an automaticity that she found so simple and so irreplaceable that the thought of not having it was not something she entertained. He learned that she was more organized than he was in every respect, and that this would be useful to acknowledge, that she had opinions about the placement of kitchen items that were non-negotiable, that she could out-calculate him in her head on any mathematical question, including cattle prices and land measurements, that she laughed with her whole body, that she cried sometimes over private things, and did not always want to be asked about them, but did want company, and that when she was frightened or worried, she went very quiet and still in a way that looked like calm but was not, and that the appropriate response was the same as it had always been, to sit beside her, to be present, to let the silence be full rather than empty. By February of 1883, she was carrying their first child, which she discovered on a Tuesday and told him on a Wednesday evening, across the supper table directly, because she was Winifred Donnelly, and she did not manage things indirectly. And he was so still for a moment that she had a half-second of doubt before she saw his face, which had gone open and young, and so undefended that it was like looking at a different person. A Frederick Donnelly who had not yet learned to be quiet about his feelings. And then he was up from the table and his arms were around her, and she felt his breath in her hair, and he said, quietly, against the top of her head, "God, Freddie." "What did you call me?" she said. "I have no idea," he said, and she felt him laughing before she heard it. "Freddie," she repeated, testing it. "You called yourself Freddie." "I called you Freddie," he said, pulling back to look at her. "I don't know why. Do you mind?" "I have never been called Freddie in my life," she said. "I think I love it." He kissed her forehead and then her face, and then she sat back down and they finished supper and talked about names and timing and the practical arrangements that a baby requires, and she watched him become more certain and more solid with each minute of the conversation, the way he always became more certain when there was a practical plan taking shape, and she thought that he would be extraordinary at this, at fathering, and she was right about that too. The baby was born in the first week of November of 1883 in the bedroom of the Donnelly house, attended by the town's doctor, who had become more capable than his original prognosis suggested, and by Clara Potts, who had appointed herself Winifred's closest friend over the intervening year with an efficiency that Winifred respected. The labor was long but not terrible, and when it was over there was a boy, a large, remarkably alert boy with Frederick's coloring and Winifred's eyes, who announced himself with a vigor that cleared the room of its tension immediately. Frederick came in when it was over and stood at the side of the bed and looked at his wife and his son with an expression that contained things too large and too various for any face to hold cleanly, and he reached out and touched the baby's hand with one finger, very carefully, the way he touched things he considered precious, and the baby's hand closed around his finger with the automatic grip of new life, and Frederick sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at Winifred and said, "I don't have the words for this." "You don't need them," she said, which was true, and he knew it was true, and that was one of the 1,000 reasons they worked. They named the baby Thomas James Donnelly Thomas for the man who had come before, whom Winifred honored and mourned honestly even in her happiness, because he had been good and had deserved a living life, and because her son deserved to know the full shape of his mother's history, and James for Frederick's father, because Frederick suggested it, and then said quickly that she didn't have to if it felt wrong, and she said it felt entirely right. Thomas James Donnelly came into the world in the Texas fall of 1883 and was met with such a concentrated quantity of attention and love that it is remarkable he didn't simply evaporate under the warmth of it. Winifred's house, the original Ralston house, was rented through the following year to Clara Potts and her new husband, who had come from Cincinnati to take a position at the expanded school, and the rental income provided a comfortable addition to the household finances, which were by now genuinely stable. Frederick expanded the herd carefully and steadily, adding to the Donnelly cattle with the same unhurried thoroughness he applied to all things, and Winifred managed the ledgers and the correspondence with the bank with an efficiency that steadily reduced the note, until by 1885 it was gone entirely. The question of the Ralston property resolved itself in 1886 when they bought out the remaining interest from the estate fully, consolidating the two parcels of land into one Donnelly holding that ran from the south pasture all the way to the North Creek line, a substantial and well-managed piece of country that represented everything they had worked for together. Miguel Ruiz came back in the spring of 1886 to work the consolidated spread as a full-time hand, with proper wages and proper accommodations in the rebuilt outbuilding, which Winifred had insisted be made properly habitable, because she had views about the conditions under which people who worked for her ought to live. He had married in the intervening years a woman named Esperanza who came with him, and who turned out to be one of the most genuinely capable people Winifred had ever encountered, who helped with the house and the kitchen garden with an expertise that made both considerably better, and whom Winifred came to count as a true friend. Hattie Beaumont retired from the dry goods store in 1885, and her daughter took it over. And while the daughter lacked Hattie's particular gift for community supervision, she ran the store well and occasionally nodded at Winifred with a warmth that had not been present in Hattie's nods. Abel Tucker eventually sold his spread and moved on, which Winifred received with equanimity. Walt Bridges remained sheriff for another decade and was a reliable and decent presence in the community. Old Mr. Greer died in the winter of 1884, peacefully, and they went to his burial, all of Dry Creek, and the Reverend said kind and true things, and Winifred stood at the graveside with Frederick's hand in hers and thought about how much could change in 2 years, how a person could go from standing alone at a burial holding the weight of grief like a stone, to standing with their hand in the hand of the person who had sat down beside them and said nothing, and given them everything. Their second child came in 1886, a girl they named Eleanor Ruth Eleanor for no particular reason, except that it was a fine name that they both liked, and Ruth for Winifred's mother, who had died when Winifred was 14, and who was present in enough of Winifred's habits and values that naming a daughter for her felt like an acknowledgement of something real. Eleanor was smaller than Thomas had been and considerably more opinionated from the first hour, which Frederick regarded with a delight that surprised even him, because he had not fully anticipated that a very small person with very large opinions would be so precisely his kind of person, and Winifred watched them together over the months that followed and thought about how wrong people were when they said that quiet men made distant fathers. He was the most present father she had ever observed. Thomas James, who was 3 when Eleanor arrived, received the news of his sister with a complicated mixture of generosity and territorial concern that resolved itself over 2 weeks into a devoted attachment that would characterize their relationship for the rest of their lives. He was already, at 3, unmistakably a combination of both his parents, her directness, his steadiness, and Winifred sometimes caught Frederick watching the boy with an expression of bemused recognition, as though he was seeing himself in a version that had been improved upon. The Donnelly spread developed a reputation in the territory over the following years for producing good cattle and being managed with integrity, which meant that when cattle prices fluctuated as they did, and as they always would in a market that was still finding its shape in a rapidly changing West, the Donnelly name carried enough weight to get fair dealing. Frederick had a talent for the commercial side of cattle ranching that was less flashy than his talent with the land and animals, but equally reliable, and Winifred's head for numbers and her willingness to engage directly with bankers and buyers on equal terms made them, as a working pair, formidable in a way that was never loud about itself. In 1880, Dry Creek itself changed, more people arriving, a second general store, a real hotel that replaced the rooms above the saloon, a doctor's office that was actually a permanent establishment rather than a rotation visit. The town was growing in the direction that many Western towns were growing in the late 1880s, becoming more settled, losing some of its frontier rawness, acquiring the structures of a more permanent civilization. Winifred watched this with mixed feelings, because the rawness had required things of her that had also developed her, and there was a part of her that was not entirely sorry to see it preserved somewhere in the difficulty of the earlier years, as a record of what she had been capable of. She wrote letters in those years to Clara Potts and her husband, who had moved to Austin when the school opportunity presented itself, and to Miguel and Esperanza Ruiz, who were still on the spread and were by now as central to it as any member of the family, and once, with a careful deliberateness, to the aunt in Missouri, a letter that was not an apology but was a reaching out, an acknowledgment of shared blood and lost time, which the aunt received and answered with a warmth that surprised Winifred, and that led to an exchange of letters over the following years that was quietly valuable to both of them. There was one evening, in the summer of 1887, that Winifred would carry forward for the rest of her life as a complete and perfect thing. The children were in bed. The evening was warm and still, with the particular quality of Texas summer evenings when the heat has backed off just enough to be bearable, and the air smells of dry grass and something distant and faintly sweet that she had never been able to name. She and Frederick were on the porch, where they spent most of their evenings when the weather allowed, because the porch of the Donnelly house faced west and the sunsets were always worth watching, and she had a letter she was writing in her lap, and he had a book, and neither of them was actively engaged with their respective occupations because the evening was too good to look away from. He set the book down and looked out at the land, and she looked up at him from the letter, and he said, "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me," she said. "When I rode into Dry Creek the first time," he said, "I came because the land was available and the winters were milder. I told you that." He paused. "But what I didn't tell you, what I've been meaning to tell you, is that I came because I was fairly certain there was nothing for me in any other direction. Not in a despairing way, but in a factual way. I didn't have family, I didn't have anywhere particular I wanted to be. I had some money and some skill and a general direction." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't expect this. I didn't know to expect it. This being," she said gently. He looked at her fully in the way he always looked at her when he was saying something true. "This being you, this being the children. This being the whole of it, the land and the supper table and the Sunday mornings and the arguments about the north pasture and the way you look at sunsets the same way you looked at the sky that day when I was first building my fences." He paused again. "I just wanted to say it, because I don't say it enough, I know that." She put the letter down. "You say it in other ways," she said. "I hear all of them." "I know you do," he said. "That's one of the reasons." She moved her chair closer to his until they were side by side, and she took his hand, and they sat in the warm evening and watched the light go off the land in long sheets of copper and pink, and the children were sleeping inside, and the cattle were in the pasture, and the land was theirs, and it was sufficient and more than sufficient. It was the kind of life that people in novels dreamed toward and never quite believed could be real, and it was real, and it was theirs. And she held onto his hand in the evening and thought about all of it, the whole thread from the beginning. She thought about standing at a burial in May of 1882, in the bruised light, with people saying things that went nowhere. She thought about the sound of boots on the dry ground, and the way he had come and sat beside her without any announcement or explanation or word. She thought about how that silence had been louder than everything anyone said that day, how it had been the most articulate thing anyone offered her, because it was the only offering that was about her actual need rather than the offerer's own need to say something, to perform a comfort, to manage the awkward presence of grief with the cotton wool of language. She thought about how she had remembered it, how it had lived in her, that quiet sitting beside, through the weeks of fence building and Tucker's interference, and the long hot summer work, and the coffee at Mrs. Dobbin's that tasted like it predated the Republic. How every word anyone had spoken to her at that burial had faded, and what remained was the particular quality of a presence that did not require words to be real. And now it was 5 years later, and the person who had sat down beside her and said nothing was the person whose hand she was holding in the warm July dark, the person in whose house she lived, and whose children she was raising, and whose cornbread she had to admit was better than hers. And she thought that if she could go back to the woman standing in that cemetery under that bruised sky, she would not be able to explain it to her in any way that would be believed, because it would sound too much like the kind of story that people put in books because it is too complete to pass as truth. But it was true. It was as true as the land underfoot and the stars overhead, and the weight of his hand in hers, warm and steady and completely there. The third child came in the spring of 1889, another boy, which Thomas received with gratifying enthusiasm and Eleanor received with the philosophical resignation of a child who has clearly been hoping for an ally of her own temperament and has received a second iteration of her brother. They named him William Frederick Donnelly, and he had Winifred's coloring and Frederick's way of looking at things, that careful, attending regard that she had first noticed at a burial and had never stopped finding remarkable. He was, from the first weeks of his life, an observer, a small person who watched the world with great intentness, storing it, attending to it, in a way that made his father say, with a quiet pride that was one of the warmest things Winifred had ever heard, "He sees things." The 1890s brought changes to the territory that were both practical and philosophical. The frontier was closing, Frederick Turner would say so famously in 1893, and everyone in the West would know it was true long before he said it, because they were living the closing, watching the open country take on roads and fences and the particular weight of settlement. Dry Creek became the town of Ralston Creek, renamed in 1891 by an act of the County Commission, a naming that came about partly because of the Donnelly spread's prominence in the local economy and the Ralston family's founding presence in the area, and which Winifred accepted with a private complexity, because Thomas Ralston had not been a great man or a passionate one, but he had been good, and he had built her 2 windows that faced east, and he deserved a name on something. Frederick took on additional land as it became available, carefully, never overextended, with the particular discipline of a man who had seen what happened to people who overextended in uncertain country. The Donnelly spread by the mid-1890s was a proper ranch, substantial enough to require 3 permanent hands in addition to Miguel Ruiz, who was now the foreman, a position he held with a quiet authority that was entirely suited to him. Esperanza Ruiz had become essential in ways that resisted simple categorization. She helped with the children when help was needed. She managed the kitchen garden in a way that made it productive and remarkable. And she and Winifred had the kind of friendship that is built on years of shared practical work and mutual respect, and the occasional frank conversation held over a fence or a kitchen table in the early morning before the day starts claiming everyone. Thomas, their eldest, took to the ranch work with a combination of his mother's organizational precision and his father's understanding of animals that made him formidable by his early teens. He had inherited both of them so thoroughly that watching him work was sometimes like watching two people operating in one body. Eleanor, who was never going to be a rancher by disposition but was brilliant by any measure, developed an interest in teaching that led her, by her late teens, to the expanded school in what was now Ralston Creek, where she was first a student, and then an assistant teacher, and then, in time, the teacher, which was a career that suited her with the completeness of a well-made shoe. William watched all of it from his early years with the careful attending gaze that never left him, and in time revealed a talent for drawing, for capturing the land and the animals and the faces of the people around him, with a precision and a feeling that made everyone who saw his work stand quietly in front of it for longer than they expected to, which is the best evidence of real talent. There was an evening in 1894. The children were 11 and 8 and 5, when Winifred came in from the barn where she'd been checking on a calving cow, still in her work clothes, hands dirty, hair coming out of its arrangement, and she found Frederick in the kitchen reading to the children from a collection of stories he'd ordered from a catalog, all three of them arranged around him at the table with the particular quality of complete attention that small people give to stories that have them. And she stood in the doorway for a moment unseen, looking at the picture of it, and felt something so large and so good move through her that she had to hold the doorframe. He looked up and saw her, and smiled the real smile, the one that had made her serious difficulty in the summer of 1882, the one that opened his face into warmth and something almost young, and she smiled back. And the children looked up, and Eleanor said, "Mama, there's a bear," with the urgency of someone mid-narrative, and Winifred came in and pulled a chair up to the table, and Frederick moved the book where she could see it too, and they finished the story with the children leaning against both of them, and the lamp making a warm circle on the table, and outside the Texas night settling itself down over the land in the way it always had and always would. This was the life. This was the specific texture of it, the everyday and the extraordinary woven together so completely that you could not pull one thread without the other coming with it. Winifred Donnelly, formerly Ralston, formerly from Kentucky, formerly the woman standing alone in a cemetery under a bruised sky wondering how to hold the weight of things, was a woman who had built something real. She had built it with her own hands and her own stubbornness and her own capacity for love. And she had built it beside a man who understood that the most eloquent thing a person can do for another person is sometimes to simply sit down beside them and be present. She was 38 years old in 1894, and she was not old by any reasonable measure, and she was not done. There were more years to come, years of good seasons and hard ones, years of watching the children grow into themselves with the particular joy and terror that is parenthood, years of the ranch expanding and the town changing around it, and the West transforming from something raw into something settled without ever quite losing, out in the land itself, the quality of spaciousness that had drawn people to it in the first place. But this moment in the kitchen, with the lamp and the children and the book and the familiar weight of his shoulder near hers, this was the whole of it distilled. This was what the life had been moving toward since the morning he rode in from the north and sat down beside her at a burial and offered her the most generous thing he had. Not words, not advice, not the performance of comfort, but simply himself, his presence, his warmth, his willingness to sit in the difficult place alongside another person and trust that the silence between them could be good. She had told him once in those early months that she remembered what he had done at the burial longer than every word anyone else spoke. He had looked at her and said that he was glad, and that he wasn't sure it had been enough, and she had said that it had been more than enough. It had been everything, and she had meant it in ways she was only now fully able to understand. It had been the truest introduction possible. It had said, "I will not cover you with words when you need space." It had said, "I will come when you need someone." It had said, "I am not afraid of your grief or your difficulty or the hard particular reality of you." It had said with a precision that language rarely achieves, "I am here." And he was. He had been every day since, in all the ways that mattered, in the fence building and the supper cooking and the hand-holding in the dark, and the sitting on the porch in the long summer evenings, and the arguing about the north pasture, and the laughing against his shoulder during an approximation of a waltz, and the name Freddie that he had called her in a moment of overwhelming feeling, and that had stuck, that she had come to love, that her children now called her, and that her friends used, Freddie Donnelly. The woman who had kept her land and raised her family and built her life on 200 acres of Texas country, and on the quality of one man's silence. The years moved forward as years do, with the unstoppable good-faith motion of time that does not pause for significance or ceremony but carries everything forward in its current, the good and the hard and the ordinary, all of it flowing together toward a horizon that is always further than it appears. Frederick and Winifred Donnelly moved through those years, the way their land moved through the seasons, with patience, with weathering, with the renewal that comes to things that are well-rooted. Thomas married in 1902, a rancher's daughter from the neighboring county named Ada, who was practical and warm, and who fit into the Donnelly operation with the easy exactness of someone who had always belonged in it. Eleanor taught at the Ralston Creek School for 20 years, and she was one of those teachers who leaves a permanent mark on the people she teaches, whose name comes up in the recollections of half-grown adults with a warmth that is the highest tribute the profession receives. William studied in San Antonio for a time, his art taking him in directions that surprised everyone and surprised no one, and he came back to the territory with a body of work that depicted the land and the people of the West with an honesty and a tenderness that people much further away eventually recognized as remarkable. And on a fall evening in 1905, the air turning cool, the sky going that deep transparent blue that Texas evenings have in October, the land golden with the late light, Winifred Donnelly sat on the porch of the house she had lived in for 23 years and watched her husband come in from the far pasture on the roan successor, a good bay horse, moving at an easy walk through the long grass. The children were long grown. The ranch was sound. The note on the land had been paid off so long ago that the original bank had changed hands twice. Thomas and Ada had 3 children of their own, and Eleanor had 2, and William had 1, and the grandchildren came on Sundays and filled the house with a density of noise and life that made it seem impossible it had ever been quiet. Frederick rode up to the barn, saw her on the porch, and raised a hand. She raised hers. He put up the horse. She could hear the familiar sounds of it, the unhitching and the water and the quiet voice he used with horses, the same voice he had always used, low and steady and without urgency. And then he came up the porch steps and sat down beside her in the chair that had been his chair for 23 years, and took her hand in his, and they looked out at the evening together. He was 52 years old, and the years had marked him the way they mark men who have lived outdoors and worked hard and felt things deeply. The lines around his eyes were deeper. His hair had gone a distinguished silver at the temples that she genuinely liked. His hands were the same capable hands she had noticed over a fence line in May of 1882 and had never stopped finding beautiful. She was 49, and she was entirely herself, with the added depth that the years give to people who have lived them fully, and she knew, from the way he looked at her still, with that attending care that was his primary mode of loving, that he saw her with a completeness that exceeded the surface. "Good day," she said. "Good day," he confirmed. "Fence line in the south needs looking at." "I'll note it," she said, which meant she would add it to the list that she kept in the kitchen ledger, the list that was the ongoing management of everything, which she had maintained for 23 years with an efficiency that made the ranch run like a well-organized fact. The silence that followed was the best kind, the kind they had been practicing since the beginning, full and warm and requiring nothing. 2 people who have learned each other completely and rest in that knowledge the way you rest in a familiar room. She thought about the woman at the burial. She thought about the sky that day, the bruise-colored sky and the words people had said, and the silence that had said more. She thought about how strange the mathematics of a life were, how a terrible morning could be the beginning of everything good, how grief could hold the seed of something that grew into 23 years of this of his hand and hers, and the children raised and the land kept, and the grandchildren coming on Sundays, and the fences mended, and the long evenings on the porch with the mockingbird in the live oak and the Texas sky going its extraordinary colors overhead. "Frederick," she said. "Winifred," he said, the way he had always said her name with a quietness and a completeness that made it sound like an entire sentence. "I was thinking about something." "Tell me," he said, and she heard in those two words the echo of the first time she had said them to him in this same place 23 years before, and she knew that he heard it too because she felt his hand tighten on hers, a small and certain pressure. "I was thinking about how the best thing that happened to me," she said, "was someone sitting down beside me and saying absolutely nothing." He turned to look at her. His face in the evening light was the face she knew completely, and it was still capable after all these years of the small, open undefendedness that she had first seen the night he told her he loved her across a supper table. "I was terrified you'd tell me to leave," he said. "I know you were," she said. "I could tell." "How?" "You sat very carefully," she said, "like a person who is trying not to take up too much space." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You never once made me feel like I was taking up too much space." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he moved his arm around her, and they sat in the evening together, and the light went off the land in its long, slow way, and the stars came out over Texas in their ancient profusion, and everything that needed to be was present, and nothing was left unfinished, and the whole of it, the long thread from that bruised May sky to this golden October evening, was complete and good and entirely, irreducibly theirs.